This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Welcome to this episode, where I'm joined once again by writer and naturalist Julian Hoffman. We dive into his latest book, Lifelines, and explore the fragile beauty of threatened landscapes, the deep connections between wildlife and culture, and what it means to belong. From regent honeyeaters losing their voices to the shifting borders that divide both people and animals, Julian shares stories that remind us of what's at stake and what still remains.
Thank you for having me back on Roots and All. It's a pleasure to be here. As you say, we recorded a podcast with my last book, Irreplaceable, which was really about local communities kind of trying to protect and preserve places that were important to them, that were under threat, whether it was a community garden or a meadow or something as big as an ancient woodland. And in many ways, I think since then, I've kind of carried on trying to tell a similar set of stories, but in a very different way, I think. I still live beside the Prespa Lakes, this ancient pair of lakes high in the mountains of northern Greece, right on the borders with Albania and North Macedonia. So that's my home place. And I'm deeply, deeply embedded in that landscape. That is, really my anchor point, I suppose. And it's not quite Greece of the imagination. For those who may not have listened to our previous podcast, there are no whitewashed houses. You'll rarely hear a bouzouki, but we do have brown bears in the beech woods, and we have thousands of pelicans that nest on these two lakes that are shared by three countries. So this is the place that I think drives a lot of my work. But from that point, I like to get out to the wider world to tell a set of stories, I think, about our connections to landscape, to plants, to the natural world, to really that living relationship that we can all engage in with the world around us.
So you obviously write about your experiences in the Prespa region. What drew you there originally, just before we kind of launch into talking a bit more about your writing?
Of course, our story of how we arrived in this remarkable and quite unique part of the Balkans was all because of a book. It kind of showed me the power of a book and really how words can change the arc of a life. My wife and I had been living in London, in North London, way back in the late 90s, and we were really ready for a major change. We were wanting to get out of the city with every opportunity we could to explore wetlands and marshes and woodlands and meadows wherever we could. And we were just really ripe for change, I think, but we had no idea where we would go until we once saw a review of a book in the back of the RSPB magazine. And it was a book called Prespa, A Story of Man and Nature, written by a Greek biologist called Yorgos Katsarakis. And this review was just marvelous. It talked about these stone villages, these two lakes, this bowl of great mountains. And we thought, well, it sounded like a wonderful place to perhaps spend a week on holiday, to go walking in the mountains and bird watching around the lakes. And when the book arrived a couple of weeks later in the post, we began reading it, and we opened a bottle of wine, and we looked at these photos in what is a rather extraordinary but very honest chronicle of a place that we had never heard of until we'd seen this review. And I think after we'd opened a second bottle of wine, which might have played a role in our decision, before going to bed that night, we decided that instead of going there for a holiday, we would just move there. And so we closed up our London lives. And 25 years later, we're still in the exact same village that we thought, or we hoped, I should probably say more accurately, might be the new place that we could put roots down in.
Yeah, that's amazing. What a brilliant story.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I look back now all these years later, and we've never regretted that move. But it still seems, how did we do that again? But that is what we did.
It's brilliant. I love it. Testament to how sometimes we ought to just follow our whims and follow our desires, and that it can happily work out.
Absolutely.
So You've been there for a while, and you very much immersed yourself in the culture and the landscape and got to know the nature around you. And you've got a new book out, which we kind of alluded to at the beginning. So can you just tell me a little bit about your book? Because I loved your book, Irreplaceable. And I have to say, whenever I speak to people and they ask me if you could recommend 3 books, then yours is one of the 3, because I think it's fantastic. I really love it. So what's your new book about?
Well, firstly, thank you very much. It's really, really kind to say. The new book is called Lifelines, and its subtitle is Searching for Home in the Mountains of Greece. And it sort of emerged during the pandemic when so many of our plans, and when I say our, people in general, were cancelled or changed. And, we had to re-find, in many respects, our place in the world. And thankfully, I didn't really suffer any losses, of close family or friends like many people had to endure. My changes were insubstantial in comparison. But the book that I was hoping to write at the time, I couldn't write because obviously there were lockdowns and everything was sort of changed and cancelled. And in that time, I realized that I was much more connected to this local landscape, once again, of mine, because I found myself thinking about it really deeply, because it was now the home place that was really the center of everyone's attention, wherever that was. If you were in a city, hopefully you had some kind of urban park that you could spend a bit of time in, a local green or blue space to connect with. And so I began realizing, particularly during the lockdown, this idea of what lifelines might mean. And I realized that perhaps the time had come to share some of our journey to Greece as a personal lifeline, let's say, but to use that as a method of exploring other lifelines, because lifelines can be rivers that move and carry these extraordinary energies. Lifelines can be the stories we pass down to future generations. Lifelines can be the songs that birds teach the juveniles within a flock. Lifelines affect us in many ways. And of course, we're fundamentally changing the lifeline of the planet itself through climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And this book is, in many ways, at the very heart of it, is the Prespa Lakes, these two ancient bodies of water, and how we came to be there. But I really use it as a basis, I think, to tell a broader story that questions, what does belonging mean? How might we become more at home in the world? Because I think one of the things that I learned when we moved to Greece is that until then I'd always assumed that the word home was a noun. It was a sort of physical place. But I've realized much more fiercely, I think, since then, that actually home can be a verb as well, because it's an act of being in relationship, not just with a place, but with people and a community. And that the act of making a home can also be shared, that it needn't just be about this is my home, but actually home is also a network of connections with the plants around you, with the human neighbors, with the wrens that used to nest in an old swallow's nest on winter nights right above our front door. I realized that home is a much bigger concept and a broader idea. And so I wanted to tell a story really about belonging and shelter, I think.
What I got from the book, and I may well be wrong, so please say, but I think that when you found perhaps there was some parts of life that were less complicated in terms of things like creature comforts even, and kind of modern conveniences, and you seemed to be living more in touch with the cycle of the weather and of nature. And I think maybe what I got from that was actually being at the mercy of nature made you more aware of the sort of, the vagaries of nature and how life could be more precipitous. Was that the case?
Yes, in many respects, it kind of was. I mean, that was partially, our desire, I think, was to be somewhere where we could grow a lot more of our food. As you know, having read the book, plants feature quite a lot because we became organic sort of farmers or market gardeners. And I tell stories about other people's relationship to plants. But we really wanted to find a way of life, let's say, that felt more in tune with the natural rhythms of the planet. Having said that, of course, one of the other things that I learned from making this move is that you still carry all of your issues and problems and difficulties with you. No simple change of place can resolve those. So that was one of the first lessons I kind of learned, that you still have to deal with all of those, which means that no move can simply take care of all the things, all the baggage that you carried with us. And so I think homing for us was really a process or a degree of mediation, both with ourselves in this new place that we were slowly and gradually becoming to know through walking in this landscape, beginning to learn a new language and listening to the stories of local people. But I think what you're sort of alluding to in a way when you begin talking about the weather, for example, or the rhythms of the earth, is that a lot of it is actually fundamentally and ultimately about attention and about perception. And I think ever since we made this big change in our lives, I've tried to be more focused on that living world that we're sort of nested within and to recognize what's going on. And I had an extraordinary moment this morning, which I'd like to share, because I'm staying with a really, really old friend of mine who actually appears in the book. And I'm in Totnes at the moment in Devon. And this morning, as he was making us breakfast, I was looking out his window and I'd seen some gulls circling over the center of Totnes. And then there was another bird that I thought, that seems a little bit different. And as it came closer, I knew what it was. And it was a red kite circling over Totnes. And my friend has lived here for 12 years and is a very avid bird watcher. And he'd never seen a red kite actually over Totnes itself. So the world is full of stories. The world is full of movements that we can engage with when we open ourselves up to these other lives that are constantly encircling our own. And I think that's perhaps one of the other meanings of lifelines that I argue in this book, that our lifelines are ultimately entwined and they hold together the greater home of us all. And so that red kite this morning that just sort of glided right over the center of Totnes, it was on its own journey, but we can also be part of these things, I think, when we pay attention to them.
Yes, and in that vein, funnily enough, one of my questions to ask you was, why is it important to tell those stories and to share them? Especially the stories of places that may be kind of under threat of being lost, or the lifestyles that may not be able to continue because of various things such as climate change.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Really good question. I think that first and foremost, stories, I believe, are engines of connection. They are, for a very long time in human history, have been the way we've sort of configured our lives in relationship to the world. We share information. We've painted stories onto caved walls. All of that is a fundamental part of how we communicate as humans. But often, of course, those stories, there's a sort of power relationship about them. And by and large, particularly in the Western world, many stories have often been excluded for reasons of exclusion, or for reasons they've been silenced because of power relationships, or marginalized because of racism, or because people believe those stories aren't important. They're not about the center of the world. They sort of exist on the margins or the peripheries. And one of the things that I argue in this book is that there's no real such thing as a periphery or a margin, because for the people who live in those places that some of us would argue, well, they don't really matter because they exist way over there. For those people, of course, those places are at the absolute heart and center of the world. They mean everything. And I think at a time when both the climate and the biodiversity crisis are undermining the stability of the planet itself, it's imperative not only that we tell stories and share stories from those other parts of the world that are right on the front line of some of these issues, but just as importantly, that we listen to them, because a story only gains force when it's heard and when it's listened to closely and attentively. And in that sense, an ear can be as transformative as a voice. It needn't necessarily mean that we have to go out and tell stories about these places, but sometimes we simply have to listen. Because I think just like community needn't always be built. Sometimes it just needs to be let be in order to exist.
Absolutely. And actually, talking of listening, there were many things in the book that really struck me. But one of them was about the birds losing their song culture.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of an aside, but, could you talk a bit about that? Because I think, talking of listening and sound, that's such a powerful story.
Yeah, thank you. So that bird is called the regent honeyeater, and that's an Australian songbird that used to exist in vast numbers, really, really vast numbers. It was extremely common and abundant. And now, sadly, there are only about 300 of them found in the world. They're endemic to Australia, so that's their entire population anywhere on this planet anymore. It's about 300 of them. And the strange and perhaps haunting and sad aspect of that numerical diminishing is that there simply aren't enough regent honeyeaters left in the world for them to transmit their cultural songs to the youngsters. And so, just if you imagine a human child growing up in one culture and then suddenly being taken out of that culture and being put in another one, where she would learn a different mother tongue and a different language. It's the exact same thing that's happening to regent honeyeaters because there aren't enough other regent honeyeaters to learn from. Young birds are now beginning to sound like other birds because they're forgetting their own songs. So they start sounding like little friar birds and black-faced cuckoo shrikes. So this is actually the loss of a song culture. And I think what makes the story of the regent honeyeater so powerful and profound is because they learn their songs in the exact same way as humans learn their own languages, because it's about culture. And I think for a very long time in sort of non-Indigenous societies, we've considered culture to be synonymous with human culture. The buildings we build, the foods we make, the songs we sing, and the stories we tell. But culture is also fundamentally at the heart of many, 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 many animal societies, and that their songs are transmitted in the exact same way as human languages are. It flows. That's this idea of lifelines, yet again. It flows between generations and within a society of birds. And so the songs of the regent honeyeater that are being lost is really about the breakdown and, sadly, the extinction of a culture.
And you do mention, actually, I've made a note of a quote, you see them as a sign of how stunningly wild the world can still be. What is it about their kind of journey that you think is indicative of actually there is a lot of wild places left that we maybe sometimes forget about?
Yeah, what's so interesting about that is because I spoke to an Australian ornithologist who was researching the regent honeyeaters about this. And they know exactly where regent honeyeaters nest. Now there's only 300 of them, but, in recent decades, there were far more, and certainly last century, there were far more. They know exactly where the regent honeyeaters nest. They prefer oaks by running water. They know exactly where the sites are. But regent honeyeaters gather together in these once immense flocks at the end of the breeding season. And this is where they transmit their songs and other behaviors to younger birds. They gather in these immense flocks, and then they depart from the breeding sites and they fly off and out and over the Australian hills. And to this day, nobody has any idea where they go. And that was remarked on way back in the 19th century when Western ornithologists first began studying the bird, and that is still true today in 2025. So despite our ability as a species to sort of map and record and to fit satellite transmitters to different species, to this day we still have no idea where the regent honeyeater goes on its migration and during those journeys. And I thought that was extraordinary when we feel that the world is so quantified and cataloged that here's a species that's being studied because of its songs, but we don't have any idea where it goes. That was a profoundly mysterious moment for me because I realized, wow, there's still a lot that is deeply wild about this world and that isn't known. To this day, isn't known. And I think that's something to savor, actually, rather than to regret.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love the fact that we think we can kind of map everything and and actually there is a lot we don't know, and also you don't know what you don't know. So there's probably, infinite amount of knowledge that we will never have because we don't even know we don't have it. But that again brings me on to another question, which is that again something that I learned from the book and just hadn't considered, that because you're kind of on a border with another country, there are these physical borders that we've imposed as humans, but that are completely ignored by other species. But our imposed physical borders do have an impact on wildlife. And I thought it'd be good to touch on that just so that people are more aware of it.
Yes, that's a really interesting point because, of course, we live at a time right now when walls, barriers, borders are going up increasingly. We all know this. Obviously, perhaps the most recognized example of this is Donald Trump's intention to continue building this great wall between the United States and Mexico. And what these borders do, obviously, they're intended by politicians to prevent the movements of people. But the other side of that coin, of course, is that what they also do is they prevent the movements of animals and other species, that we are literally driving division points down species' entire home worlds, their homelands, their territories. And what that inevitably does is shrink the places in which they're able to live. And I think because I started writing this book during lockdown, I realized that the physical lockdowns we experienced during the pandemic was only one way of experiencing a shrinking world, because for much of the wild world, it's constantly having to endure different types of lockdowns because we are making their homes and the spaces they dwell and exist within smaller and smaller by the day. So there was this striking parallel for me when I became attuned through our own lockdowns of what we also do to the wild world. And I think borders, when they're physical impediments, obviously, especially, they prevent this greater ability to connect the lifelines of the world. And this is one of the things that I think sits at the heart of the book, that we have to find new ways of thinking about borders. And what this inevitably means, of course, is finding new ways to think about what connectivity, about belonging and community and what they ultimately mean, so that we're able to not only enrich those spaces for wild species, but we also have to find a different way and a different perspective on the movements of people, because people have always moved since time immemorial, and we all left Africa where we began. Movement is the heart of the human enterprise, and it's not going to stop. So we really need to rethink our position on what borders mean and constitute, and how these lifelines can remain knitted together.
Yes, again, I could ask you a million questions around that because, you were able to move and there were issues around that, around moving from one country to another. And the landscape of that has changed for people, especially in places like Europe. There's all of that comes to bear on it. But a lot of people, I think, who listen will have at some point thought, you know what, it would be lovely if I could just relocate. If people were listening and they did foster this dream to kind of try a different life or relocate, your take on it is going to be quite specific given your experiences. But what would you say to people who are thinking about it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting take, because I think, we do often, all of us harbor, many of us, I should say, perhaps rather than all of us, but harbor dreams of sometimes being elsewhere. And we were no different in that sense. And I'm absolutely the first person to say I'm an immigrant, and I really dislike terms that are sometimes used, such as expat, for example. I'm an immigrant. And in that sense, I'm no different from so many of the world's other immigrants. And my family had originally come from Germany way back in the 19th century. My great-grandfather ended up in England. He was an immigrant. My parents then departed for Canada, where I grew up. We were immigrants there, and I've now moved to Greece. And so movement has been at the heart of my personal lifeline, story of my ancestors in many respects. And so I think what I would say to those that are thinking about making a move similar to ours, the greatest advice I can give, I think, is to be open to what surrounds you, and also to the possibilities that might not seem to be there at first glance. But when you approach anything with an open heart and an open mind, I think things become more visible the more open you are. And I think as people, as humans, we do have a tendency to not be as open as we would necessarily like to be, because we have the habits of our own culture, our cultural traits. And yet the great joy of moving to Greece, and especially this part of Greece, where it's fringed by two whole other countries, is that it's completely different from the culture and language and landscapes that I was used to. And I think that celebrating difference is so crucially important, not just on a personal level, but also at a cultural and political level. And I think being able to embrace difference is a huge part of making any kind of journey that might be similar to ours successful in the end. Because if you wish to do something but remain closed off to that world around you, it will be a bigger challenge than almost anything else.
Good advice. I am going to put you on the spot a bit here, so feel free to not answer this question. But is there anything that you would like to say to your adopted homeland in Greek for anybody who's listening who might be Greek? You don't need to translate it. The rest of us will just have to live in blissful ignorance. But yeah, if there's anything you want to say, feel free.
Well, I could say it in both languages, because for me, it's a really simple thing, is that the country is our home, and that place. I presbydi ladine to spitimas. A
huge thank you to Julian for returning to share his insight and stories, and to you for continuing to support the podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, I recommend checking out episode 53 with Julian on his book Irreplaceable, and episode 197 with Benedict Macdonald, where we dive deep into the state of Britain's birds and the future of conservation. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.